Hello and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. This is our third session, third executive briefing on the Iran conflict, today hosted by me, Ed James, Head of Content Analysis, MEED and Global Data, and Colin Foreman, the editor of MEED. Now, as our two previous executive briefings, Colin and I will be going over a few slides, giving our thoughts on the situation, this very fluid situation as it stands today. And then we'll be taking your questions in a Q&A session. You'll see in the chat box that there are already a number of questions submitted in advance by our users, our clients. And if you have any that you wish to ask either Colin or myself, or indeed have any comments you wish to make, please type them into the chat box here on the YouTube page, and we'll do our best to answer them if we can. Right, so without further ado, let's push on to the situation in hand, the latest situation on the Iran conflict. This is, of course, being recorded. It's live on YouTube. It's also being recorded and will be available on the MEED YouTube channel once this is over. So if you want to keep up to date with the latest briefings and latest webinars and data and information from me, please subscribe to the MEED YouTube channel, and you'll get first access and first alerts to when we push out our content. Of course, also feel free to join our LinkedIn mega thread on the situation for the latest news and updates and opinions on this very fast flowing situation. So here's a summary of the events over the past 48 hours. I'm sure many of you are keeping up to date and refreshing regularly on your news feeds for what's happening in the situation. But here is a quick rundown of the latest news emerging from the situation. Perhaps the most striking of all is the death or the hit on Ali Larijani, the Secretary of the Supreme National Security Council, just yesterday by Israel. He, along with his son and his chief of staff, were killed by an Israeli airstrike. And that, of course, was a major blow for Iran, as Ali Larijani was one of the most visible leaders during this situation. He was commenting regularly, was seen in public regularly, making public comments about the situation. So his death will create another vacuum in the power apparatus and power hierarchy in Iran. At the same time, or the same day, Israel also announced that it had killed Gholam Rezi Soleimani, who was the head of the Basij paramilitary force, a sort of civilian paramilitary arm of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. His deputy, Sayed Karishi, was also killed. And again, this is another sort of blow to the Iranian leadership in terms of decision-making and hierarchy there. The Basij, of course, the paramilitary forces has been responsible for enforcing some checkpoints and putting down unrest within Iran over the last few months. And you also may have seen some videos released by Israel of attacks on some of the checkpoints and some of the Basij and Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps facilities, headquarters, and so on in Iran. So certainly from a leadership perspective, that has thrown into more doubt some of the decision-making going on in Iran, especially taking into account that no one has seen Mujtaba Khamenei, the new supreme leader, since he was announced as the new supreme leader a few days back. So at the moment, this is contributing to a little bit of the uncertainty around what's happening in Iran, which we'll talk about in a bit. Now, from an oil price perspective, oil prices remaining high, as you would expect, with the Strait of Hormuz largely closed to GCC oil and gas exports. Oil sitting around a little over $100 a barrel right now. That's despite the IEA releasing some 400 million barrels of emergency reserves. The US says it is or has neutralized 16 Iranian mine-laying vessels, which could lay mines on the strait, effectively closing it. It's also destroyed more than 30 Iranian naval vessels too, it says. But that said, the amount of traffic flowing through the strait is at a minimum, just 3 or 4 vessels a day. There is evidence that Iranian oil and gas is still being exported through the strait, and also Iran has said that it's allowing neutral party oil and gas exports also to flow through. Some Iranian and Pakistani vessels, for example, are reported to have flown through as well. Nonetheless, this uncertainty around the Strait of Hormuz and the effective closure for oil and gas exports from the region has been responsible for pushing up the oil and gas price, and has resulted in situations like Sri Lanka announcing a four-day working week to conserve energy supplies. Thailand, for example, just today requesting people to take off their jackets and to lower air conditioning in order to save costs. We've seen big falls in the Korean stock exchange, for example, big importers of oil and gas. So still big impacts from the result of the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. From a missile and drone strike perspective on the GCC states, we have seen a continuation of Iranian oil and missile and drone strikes on the 6 GCC states. Although the numbers are lower, considerably lower than they were for the first 3 or 4 days, there has actually, and we'll see that in a second, been a small uptick in the number of attacks. So despite US and Israeli efforts to impact or hit launch sites, the mobile launchers and the drone launch sites, Iran is still able to and has been increasing the number of attacks or launches on the GCC states. Although most of the missiles and drone attacks are still being successfully intercepted. And as a result of that ongoing launch of attacks on the GCC states, aviation continues to be hit with operations at the GCC major airports still being impacted and affected. Flights continue to operate at a much lower level than before. And there have been intermittent suspensions of aviation and airspace closures. And as a consequence of that, of course, tourism and retail sectors in the GCC states continue to be widely affected. Again, we'll take some, your questions about that, and we'll talk about that in this presentation. Just a reminder, if you do have any questions to ask, please put them into the live chat box, and Colin and me will do our best to answer them once this presentation is over. So again, just in terms of the total number of drone and missile attacks, as you can see here, UAE continues to bear the brunt of the attacks. One must assume that Iran views it attacks or launches of drone and missiles on the UAE as having the biggest economic and geopolitical impact, and continue to launch the majority of their missiles and drones on the UAE. However, as you can see, Kuwait, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar also have been hit over the course of the last 2 weeks. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there was or has been a big decline in the total number of daily attacks from the peak of 922 on the second day of the conflict on the 1st of March. But we have seen in the last 3 or 4 days an increase on the number of attacks compared with a low point of 22 daily attacks on the 11th of March. So Iran has been able to increase the number of missile and drone attacks despite US and Israeli military efforts to hit mobile launchers and those drone launch sites. So it doesn't appear for now as if those numbers are dropping off. Now, before I pass over to Colin, I wanted to give you all a few scenarios that we see potentially playing out on the situation. Of course, it's extremely difficult to be able to predict what's going to happen for various different reasons. First of all, of course, we have a very mercurial US president, President Trump. Changes his mind regularly, but says sometimes contradictory things, and it's not clear at all when or how this conflict is going to end from both the US side and from the Iranian side. On the Iranian side as well, with a sort of vacuum at the leadership and with no clear military objectives, it's very difficult to understand how the scenarios may play out. However, here are 5 scenarios that we see that could happen. None of them are actually of a high likelihood. At best, due to the fluidity of the situation and so many unknown unknowns, we only have some medium likelihood scenarios. In the first scenario, which has a low likelihood, this is one which is the ideal scenario for the US and Israel. This is where the Iranians rise up and dispose the government and impose a more Western-leaning or friendly administration, which gives up its nuclear ambitions and reaches a peace deal and opens up the economy and sanctions are lifted. This is, I guess, what the initial hope was by the US and Israel when they decapitated the Iranian leadership. However, there's little sign of any uprising amongst the Iranian population, perhaps having been affected by the strong clampdown in January, when we saw anything between 5 and 30,000 deaths of Iranian civilians by the Iranian government. And right now, one can say there's only a very small likelihood of that happening. And indeed, that's really playing into this uncertainty, because without that happening, it's very difficult to see what the US military objective currently is. And without that, it's very difficult for them to be able to declare a victory at this current moment in time. Okay, a second scenario, which has a medium likelihood of 30 to 40% chance of happening, in our opinion. And this is where there are some sort of diplomatic back channels, some negotiations going on behind the scenes, perhaps with Omani or Swiss involvement, where both sides are trying to reach an agreement where they can both hold face and both declare victory. This is with the military and nuclear facilities in Iran largely destroyed, but with the regime remaining in place. And they reach some sort of uneasy agreement where they can both claim victory, with Iran maintaining its regime, but the US being able to access and being able to say it has destroyed the nuclear program, but with monitors in place to be able to monitor that. It's difficult to see this being a high likelihood, simply because there's too much distrust. Currently, both sides are saying that they're unable to talk to each other currently, and it's probably neither party's optimum sort of wish list, as it effectively goes back to that previous status quo. Perhaps the most likely scenario, and is one which is maybe the one which is least palatable for us sitting here in the GCC right now, is a sustained low-intensity conflict where the US declares unilaterally victory, saying that it's destroyed Iran's nuclear program and its military, it's decapitated its leadership, and ends it from its side of the conflict. However, Iran doesn't play along. It continues fighting. It continues low-level conflict with the occasional launch of missiles and drones on the GCC states and Iran and US military facilities, and on Israel as a whole. It maintains closure of the Strait of Hormuz, ensuring that oil and gas prices remain elevated, and basically this period of uncertainty continues for the foreseeable future. The US is unable to force a change here. It has unable to prevent continuing strikes on the GCC, and Iran, with little to lose, maintains this low-level conflict for the foreseeable future in order to try and get more gain more from the situation, more concessions from the US in order to force its hand and emerge from the whole conflict with its reputation intact and its position enhanced. So that's probably, as it stands today, unfortunately, the most likely scenario. I'm not saying it's a likely scenario, but it's the most likely scenario of the ones outlined here as it stands today. Another situation, one which has been commented on, one which has been mused on by the US, is actually the US, in order to force a resolution to this whole crisis, in order to enforce regime change, actually invades Iran by putting Marines on the ground or soldiers on the ground to try and overthrow the regime. This is not a very, this has a low likelihood simply because of the sheer economic and human cost of this, the uncertainty that this would result, the almost certain unpopularity of such a move in the US. It's very difficult to see this happening, although it has been talked about. Perhaps a sort of lower level invasion, perhaps of Marines sitting on the Karg Island in the Gulf, where Iran produces most of its oil and gas. The US does that in order to gain leverage over Iran. But it has been something that has been talked about, although we don't think it's very likely. And then again, another kind of unideal situation, again, like a low likelihood, but something that could happen is where both sides sort of declare victory, both stop the conflict, both stop attacking each other, but there's a kind of uneasy truce, an uneasy peace, a kind of status quo, with Iran becoming more and more isolated, a kind of like North Korea regime, but a continued threat or perceived threat to the region. Again, not very likely, we don't think, in our perspective, simply because it's not an ideal solution for either side. So these are some scenarios we can see potentially playing out. Of course, it's possible that a completely different scenario pans out. At this moment, it's very, very difficult to predict. Very fluid situation. Very difficult to know how the situation will pan out. Eager to hear if any of you have any of your own opinions on how it will play out. Please put that into the chat box comment, and we'll be happy to see your points of view as well. Okay, over to you, Colin, for specific viewpoints on particular sectors and areas of the market and economy in the region.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Ed. Just to touch on some sectors specifically, I think what we've seen so far is a conflict which we've been mostly talking about the security impacts, and when it comes to the economy, the most immediate thing that we've talked about has been oil prices and energy, because obviously that has a widespread global impact. A little bit more on the local and regional scale, there's a few other sectors which we're now starting to see the impact of the conflict kicking in, and the first one to talk about is tourism. The WTTC put out a report that said it's costing the Middle East region about $600 million a day in lost international spending, which just gives you an idea of the economic cost of the disruption that's going on at the moment. And why is that happening? Some statistics there just to give you an idea of how important the region is for the aviation market. While it's just 5% of global international arrivals, it's 14% of international traffic, and people that travel through the region will know that there's major aviation hubs, particularly in Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Doha, and Bahrain, and Dubai in particular has been disrupted quite a bit over the last 2 weeks, and there's some information on that on the next slide. But before I get to that, just in terms of passenger numbers, it's 526,000 passengers daily. So we can see there's a major impact globally to aviation, which is adding to the stress that we're already seeing in the oil and energy markets. And then in terms of what to look for in the future, the WTTC remain cautiously optimistic. saying that the sector can rebound if the conflict isn't drawn out too long, which I think just then returns us back to the slide that Ed was discussing before. I think a lot of the outlook across all sectors is really dependent on how long the conflict continues for and what the outcome is. So at the moment, cautiously optimistic, but a lot of that depends on the duration of the conflict. We go to the next slide, please. Related to that is aviation, obviously. The airports have been affected by strikes, but people will see that there's been a limited return to service offered by airlines operating out of the region's major airports. We can see there on the right a chart from the Financial Times, which is just showing how many flights are operating now compared to what was planned. So we can see a significant amount of disruption there. I've put a chart there at the bottom. It's very difficult to get an idea of the financial impact of this on the different airlines. But in terms of share price, Air Arabia, which is listed, we can see their share price has dropped by about 16% over the past 2 weeks. So there's an impact there on the outlook for the aviation sector, certainly. And why are we seeing that? As I said, flights are cancelled and delayed. On top of that, there's operational challenges. So a lot of routes are being diverting or rerouting to avoid conflict areas. This means planes are having to fly further, which means they have to carry more fuel. On top of that, they're loaded with more fuel just in case there's an issue at their destination and they have to circle for longer or have to land at another airport. So that's additional weight that they have to carry just to carry the fuel and, of course, the extra fuel cost. And then on top of that, passenger numbers are down. So really, it's the costs are going up and revenues are going down, which is not what you want if you're operating a business. So quite a bit of disruption there for the aviation sector. And then the next slide, please. Yeah, on the industry front, which is another key sector for the region, perhaps less high profile than tourism and aviation, but industry is a major part of the region's economies. And if we just look here at Alba in Bahrain, which is Aluminium Bahrain, which is the work says it's the world's largest single site aluminium smelter. What's important here is the impact that Alba has on Bahrain's economy. It's a massive driver of GDP, and due to the disruption with shipping in the Strait of Hormuz, they've closed three of their reduction lines, which is about 19% of their total output. So we can see a real economic impact kicking in there. Just to add to that, one project which I've been tracking over the last couple of years is a project to replace those three lines. Lines 1, 2, and 3 are the oldest reduction lines at Alba, and there is a plan to replace them with newer, more efficient lines. So ultimately, these lines were scheduled to be closed down anyway, and that's now happened due to the conflict. So we can see the economic impact is starting to creep into some of the real sort of key sectors in the region's economies. In terms of other sectors, we're starting to see a few signs of disruption and impact, but I would say for the most part, the concern is more of one of cost escalation going forward as things like oil prices and supply chain disruption start to have a greater impact. And again, that's linked into how long does the conflict go on for. So at the moment, these are the main areas of impact, but going forward, a lot depends on those scenarios which Ed outlined earlier. And ready to take some questions, Ed.
Thank you, Colin. Yes, you can see that we've obviously discussed before the impact on the oil and gas industry and tourism and aviation impact, but it goes wider than that, as you've pointed out, to industry, to aluminium, steel exports, and one of the maybe overlooked aspects of this is fertilizers. A good chunk, I think, anything between a quarter and a third of the world's fertilizers come out of the Gulf as well, which are going to be impacted by the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, and that's going to also impact food production and food prices globally. So there's certainly big global impacts, aren't there?
Yeah, that's a good point, Ed. There was a question there asking about how does this conflict differ from previous crises that we've had, and specifically about the COVID-19. But it's good you pointed out the fertilizers there. I mean, we were talking a lot about fertilizers following the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the impact of fertilizer exports and affecting markets in our region, such as Egypt, which it would affect food production, etc. So yeah, we're starting to see quite a lot of disruption across global supply chains, and that's affecting all sorts of parts of the economy.
So we've got lots and lots of questions already, and Colin and I will answer them now. But if you do have any more you want for us to ask during this Q&A session over the next half an hour or so, please put them into the live chat box, and we'll do our best to answer them. Alternatively, as well, we'd be happy to hear your comments and your views, what you think about the scenarios that we've outlined. Good to hear your opinions, whether you agree, disagree, and we can have a chat about those as well. Colin, question here. Let's just say the whole conflict resolves tomorrow. How long would it take for the construction industry, aviation, tourism to get back to normal? Real estate, get back to normal. Will it ever be the same again?
Let's pick them off one by one, because I think the answer is slightly different for all of them. I think construction, not too much of an impact. I think you'd need shipping to sort of sort itself out a little bit. So there might be a little bit of disruption in terms of supply chain and cost. But I think construction's an interesting industry. It takes quite a long time for macroeconomic shocks to impact construction, unlike something like tourism, where it's very immediate. So construction, if it ends tomorrow, I can see the impact not being so great in terms of projects that are on the ground at the moment. There's possibly a question mark then over what direction the economy has in the future based on the outlook for some of the other sectors. But in terms of ongoing construction work, I don't think will be greatly affected. In terms of real estate's a very, very interesting one. Obviously, we're sitting on a very buoyant, particularly in Dubai property market, but also in other parts of the region. Sales were at very strong numbers, sales prices and rentals. There were some concerns in the marketplace about oversupply, and some people say the market was heading towards a correction, not a sharp correction, but some element of market softening. And there was no real expectation of a hit to demand. What we're seeing now is that there's a concern there about what demand is like going forward. I think really that's probably where the answer to the real estate question lies, and what's the demand like. We know that there's people left the region, and there are concerns that some of the economic malaise will affect the job market and the number of people here, which will impact the demand. So I think really it becomes a demand question, whereas when we were talking about the real estate market in 2025, in the very beginning of this year, we were really looking at that supply number and saying how many units are being brought online, will they be delayed? So I think the demand question is important there. And another important factor or component of that demand question is perception. So I think there's a risk perception which is very difficult to predict, given that we now know there's a risk there in terms of conflict with Iran. That risk was already there. There was always a risk of conflict with Iran, but that risk is now, I think, front and center in a lot of people's minds. So it'll be the different answer for different investors. So that's real estate. Aviation, I would say that aviation, possibly more than tourism, has been the most impacted so far. It's starting to return to operations, but I think that will take some time to return back to previous levels. Similarly with tourism, and again, there's that perception and confidence factor in there, which is very difficult to predict and isn't the same answer for everybody. But I think the region in general is going to have to overcome that problem once the conflict's resolved. I think one thing which the region has shown in the past is that it has successfully dealt with significant challenges before and has been able to market itself and convince the world and investors and customers that it is a region that's worth investing in or visiting or doing business in. So I think they'll need to draw on those skills once again once the conflict ends.
Yeah, which I think just goes back again to the sort of scenarios, doesn't it? Because if you have a scenario where there really is no conclusive end to the conflict, or where the uncertainty remains, where the regime remains, for example, then yes, there's greater uncertainty, isn't there? And that hits investor confidence. Uncertainty being, one of the biggest killers of investor confidence. Whereas if, for example, there was a regime change or the removal of sanctions and sort of peace, then that would be very different. So I guess it does depend on how exactly this conflict ends or is resolved.
Yes, very much so. Very much so.
What about a question here about events? Now we know that the region, particularly Dubai, is very much an events destination. Big exhibitions, conferences, and so on. What kind of impact is that having on events?
For the most part, we're seeing that events in the short term are being cancelled. However, there are some still events going ahead, and they tend to be the things that are more backed by the government. The government seems to be more committed to continuing with events as normal than the private sector. I think that's an element of portraying confidence, and also the private sector worry about the risk of if the event gets cancelled at the last minute, they're financially at risk. So I think, yes, we are seeing some events still going ahead, but there's a lot that aren't.
Yeah, and of course we've seen also in terms of sporting-based events, cancellation of the Bahrain and Saudi Grand Prix.
Yes, and again, just going back to that global impact. I mean, obviously, the Formula One season is a global event across multiple cities and multiple regions. So it's even in the sporting world, there's a global impact there.
Okay, I wanted to ask you, Colin, about logistics and particularly the import of construction materials and how much impact this situation has on logistics costs, delays to the import of materials, material costs. We've seen last year, for example, the closure of the Red Sea hit certain projects hard, for example, NEOM. Is it as serious this time round, or is it a case of being able to find workarounds to it? What are your views on that?
I mean, I think the situation's a little bit different to the Red Sea one. The Red Sea one last year, there was projects that were being developed on the Red Sea coast that were greenfield projects with a very inelastic supply chain. So everything was being shipped in because it was a remote location that was completely reliant upon shipping, and then any threat to shipping in the Red Sea was obviously having an impact on them. I think what we're seeing today, in some ways, is a bigger issue. The threat to shipping through the Strait of Hormuz is a bigger global impact than the Red Sea was at the time. However, within the region, certainly on the Gulf Coast and the established cities, which have got long-standing, very active projects markets, there's a lot of supply chain which is developed in region or in country or even within city. So there's a much more elastic supply chain that can take up some of the issues that may be caused by some international things being delivered. That said, I wouldn't want to sit here and say that there won't be an impact at all on supply chain. Of course, there will be an impact on supply chain, but I think it's a slightly different problem to the one last year that we saw in the Red Sea. But ultimately, as supplies get delayed and it becomes difficult, it's going to have an impact on cost and time.
Mm. And of course, it's worth bearing in mind as well that there are alternative import channels, right? Soha and Salalah, for example, in Oman, and for Saudi Arabia, I believe a lot of construction materials tend to be tend to be imported into the Jeddah Islamic port from the Red Sea rather than from the Gulf itself. So that is, also means that there's some insulation from some of this disruption too.
Yes,
But
and I mean, I think another thing which we talked about last week is overland transport as well. So things
yeah,
do get trucked within the region, and I think one lesson that we're going to take from this crisis is that overland transport remains very important. At the moment, the GCC is very reliant on aviation and shipping to move goods around and people, and I think there'll be a renewed push to make sure that there's other overland links, and one that we've written about a lot over the last 5 years is rail, and my expectation is that that will progress even more in the future.
Yeah, I can imagine this will add a lot of impetus to the long-awaited Saudi land bridge project between Jeddah and Riyadh and Dammam, that long in the planning, and also perhaps potentially the GCC railway as well. We know that UAE has built a railway to Fujairah, bypassing Strait of Hormuz, but is also building through the Hafid railway a railway to Sohar port. Partly, I imagine, for just this kind of scenario, to be able to find alternative import channels as well. So I imagine there'll be more momentum for such projects to move cargo and freight going forward, especially now that considering that there's been a steep increase of over 27% over the last couple of years in diesel prices in Saudi Arabia alone, which is going to pushing up land transport by truck quite considerably. So again, I think all these things will be impacted and directing policy going forward. Okay, so lots of questions here. I'm going to keep another question we had in advance is about the impact on oil and gas capital projects in the short and medium term, which is an interesting question. And indeed, MEED's been reporting on a number of big contract awards recently, which have been taking place amid this uncertainty. I can think of the Habshan 7 project by ADNOC. I think there's also an NGL Plant 5, Moraes as well. Both have reached contract awards. I also know bids have been submitted for a couple of major projects, and indeed tendering is also ongoing. Aramco is still regularly releasing RFPs and RFQs. So as it is with construction, where we've seen a large number of not a large number, but a number of contract awards made over the last 10 days, and also tenders being issued. I believe in the oil and gas sector, it's also, we haven't seen a big slowdown in procurement. Procurement is still going on. Tenders are still being released. FIDs are still being made and contracts being awarded. So it does seem from a sort of project's perspective that the market is continuing at a fairly regular pace, despite this conflict. Colin, do you agree with that?
Yes, and again, going back to that question earlier where it was asking about comparisons with previous crises, I think if we look back in time, if we remember back to the global financial crisis, 2008, 2009, we saw a lot of projects being put on hold. I was reporting on construction then, and on a weekly basis, there was major projects being put on hold, and it wasn't just being put on hold. Sometimes you get projects being put on hold when they're in the design or planning stages, but this was projects that were on site and active being put on hold. We haven't seen that really in any other test that we've had to the market. So in the sort of drop in oil price 2014, 2015, we didn't really see that. And again, in COVID, we didn't really see that. We saw some spending slowing. Again, with the oil price drop, we saw some spending slowing, but it wasn't just putting projects on hold. So I think there's a question there as well asking about what to look for going forward to see if the economic impact is becoming more severe. For me, as someone that follows the project sector closely, I think that the real test of a market to sort of say this is a very, very deep crisis is projects being put on hold once they're already under construction, and we haven't really seen that yet. I mean, you obviously get the odd example here and there on a project by project basis, but to have a widespread spate of projects being put on hold, I think is the thing to watch for, and that's when you really need to start worrying. But as of yet, there's no sign of that.
Okay, yeah, quite right. I mean, obviously we all remember, well, most of us remember the 2009 real estate crisis and crash and everything. Suddenly, construction sites suddenly deserting, and but also in COVID as well, a lot of work on site stopped. Right now, if you look at the construction sites, they're still as busy as ever. Okay, some other questions. Let's have a look. How do you see Oman's role in the conflict? Oman, despite being a neutral party and staying out of the sort of conflict, has actually been hit a couple of times, hasn't it?
Yes, I think yes, neutral, be strategically important. Obviously, sitting outside the Strait of Hormuz, and I think the Iranian leadership has signaled that they're very focused on creating economic disruption and economic pain, so that other countries will put pressure on the US and Israel not to continue with strikes against them. So I think it's part of that, if you want to call it, economic war that that Iran is waging at the moment.
A question we've had before in the previous webinar discussion is about marine and coastal projects and their impact. Do you see anything major happening there?
No, I mean, I'm assuming that the question is being asked on the basis that if you're on the coast, then you're potentially more exposed to um, anything that's launched from Iran. But at the moment, I haven't seen that having any impact on the project front. I have heard of a couple of sites that are in coastal areas where they've had a temporary pause of works. The one that's most high profile is the Wind Resort project in Ras Al Khaimah, which paused work last week. But I haven't heard of any long-term change in planning in terms of coastal development. And I mean, we've got a couple of stories which we're working on in the editorial team of some significant contract awards for building residential units in coastal development. So it certainly seems as if those developments are continuing.
Okay, thanks for that. And a comment really here is the main uncertainty is when the war will end. And I completely agree with that comment. It's uncertainty in general. It's uncertainty how the war will end as much as when it will end. We can see from Trump that he's saying, it's almost done. It's another week, another 2 weeks. We get a kind of feeling from the US that they're moving towards a point where they're ready to sort of declare it over. But it remains to be seen whether Iran sees it the same way and will continue on saying, no, thank you very much. We're going to reject a ceasefire and continue. So that's very much, I think, the sort of uncertainty here, when it will end, but also how it will end, because it can end, but the big uncertainty remains, as Colin discussed, and that will affect investor appetite and affects economies and real estate and tourism, aviation, and I think that's probably the biggest unknown here right now, really, isn't it? It's just this lack of known objective or how the US or Israel could declare victory. And then, as someone has pointed out, tension becomes the baseline. This sort of tension, uncertainty, if that's the norm, then that's obviously a situation no one wants to have going forward. Colin, what a question here about the potential for recession in the Gulf and in Dubai. Do you think there's much potential there? I mean, I know obviously oil prices go up, which ironically means revenues go up and so on. But
I mean, obviously there's potential for it. I think it's too early to make any of that sort of call, but obviously there's some serious economic questions that we'll need to be asking over the coming months. So potential, yes, but I think it's too early to make that call. I think there's one interesting question there, which was asking about IT spending by oil companies, particularly on IT security. I think that's something that is going to come into focus a lot more. You're hearing of quite a few cyber attacks going on at the moment, and I think that IT security, but also security in general, I think you're going to see. I mean, there was always a focus on security, and as we've seen over the last 2 weeks, the GCC has been very effective in repelling a large number of attacks. But I think that will remain the case.
Comment here also, what if the Bab el Mandeb Strait also was closed? The Houthis doing what they did last year and the year before, potentially closing that. I mean, it's interesting that they haven't actually attempted that.
Yes, yes, and that would obviously again challenge shipping even more and create some problems, particularly for Saudi Arabia, which has been moving oil by pipe from the eastern province across to the west coast.
Okay, comment and question here about gold and commodity pricing. Obviously, you've got the impact of this conflict on gold prices, but we mustn't forget as well that a large chunk of gold refining and gold trade is done through Dubai, and the impact on imports and exports of gold and other precious commodities as well. It's not something I've done a lot of research on or thought about, to be honest, until it's been mentioned just now. But that is something as well that perhaps also needs considering.
I have seen some stories referring to bullion prices in Dubai being lower as a result to the transport difficulties. That was about a week ago, I would say. So I haven't seen the latest numbers, but I have seen reports reflecting that comment.
Okay, very good. Well, thank you very much to everyone for all of your questions and comments, and for listening in today. Both Colin and I really appreciate your thoughts on this, and if you do have any comments or questions that you want to ask us, please email us, WhatsApp us anytime, and we'll be more than happy to engage with you. Otherwise, just a reminder that this whole webinar is being recorded and will go up onto YouTube immediately after this session. I can see a good 600 people joined us today, and we've had more than 6,000 people watch and join in on our live webinars over the last 2-3 sessions. So thank you all very much for that. We hope you find it valuable and insightful. If you do, please subscribe to the MEED YouTube channel. You'll also see lots of other webinars and videos there on different topics, ranging from giga projects to the power market, the oil and gas sector, to the wastewater market in the region, and railways and so on. And also join our LinkedIn, MEED LinkedIn thread, where we are publishing a host of opinions and papers and news articles and analysis on not just this situation, but the market in general in the region. So thank you very much for joining. We hope you found it valuable and useful. And we'll be back after Eid next week with another session, hopefully discussing the end of the conflict, but if not, discussing the latest developments on it. But in the meantime, we just want to wish you all a very safe and blessed Eid, Eid Afit, Eid Mubarak in advance, and we'll speak to you all again very soon. So from me and Colin, thank you very much, and stay safe. Goodbye.